If it says microgroove, you know what that means. This is an LP, but it's not. Here we go. Coming back out, coming back out, coming back out. Look at that. It is a 7-inch microgroove record that runs at 33. So this bizarre record, I found this and a stack of about 15 like this from different artists, all in Colombia, and they all came in sleeves that looked like this. Sleeves like that. Mind you, again, 7-inch. These were all at a weird thrift store by my chiropractor's office. And every time I went in there, there was kind of the same stuff. It was weird. They had tons of console TVs. This is about 3-4 years ago. And the stock never seemed to change, but then there's always one really amazing find somewhere in the back. So I think these were 10 cents a piece. And I bought the whole stack of them. Benny Goodman is probably the best known artist that was in the stack, aside from, I think there was some Tony Bennett's. There may have been a Frank Sinatra. I'm drawing a blank now. But these are from an era that online, if you try and look it up, you're probably going to get confused. So here's what happened. The LP record was introduced in 1948, running at 33 RPMs, and it was 10-inch, sometimes 12-inch, to replace the 78. Columbia Records came up with that. This is in 48. About 17 years before this, RCA Records, RCA Victor, the other big American record company, had tried to do a similar thing with 33s, and it just didn't work. But this time they were ready. They put it out in 48, in mid 48. 6 months later, RCA announced we're going to be putting out 7-inch 45s. So those are the two formats we've had pretty much ever since. 33s at 12-inch and 45s at 7-inch. However, early 49, as just before RCA started putting out their 45s, Columbia did this. They said, we're going to start releasing singles, 7-inch singles, at 33. Now, there's a few things that you need to be aware of with this that were good or not so good. Number one, they did that to try and avoid a speed war. Their plan was for the 33 speed and 33 records to completely replace 78s. They didn't know that RCA was going to come out with 45 and then completely throw things off and then require turntables like this one to have 3 speeds. See that? Mine's got 3 speeds. A lot of the ones from the 40s, well, 50s, 60s, 70s had the 3 speeds. Eventually they started to drop the 78 speed in the late 70s on a lot of tables. But Columbia did this. It was actually a good idea. They said, we'll make 12-inch and 10-inch for long playing, and then we'll make 7-inch like this for 45s, for one song on piece, singles, pop singles. It would have been great. And I think that people it would have been much better to just have one and then eventually, or 2 and then eventually 1 speeds. Wouldn't have even had to worry about 45. And by the way, if you've ever wondered how we got these speeds, 78, I think, was chosen initially, way back, because it was the only speed that the motors could keep constant back in, the clock-making days of the 1800s. And it also was the one that was chosen for the cylinder by Edison, and then they just kept up with the speed. And then at some point, they introduced 33 because it had to do with film transcription and film sound and the discs that would go with films when you put them in the theater for sound. But then 45, if you know some math, check that out. 33 plus 45 equals 78. So that's how we got all those. There's actually 33 and a third, 78.26. It's a whole thing. But now you know how those speeds came about. So anyway, getting back to this, it's the late 40s. Columbia's got 12 and 10-inch 33s. They decide we're going to also put out 7-inch for pop, and that's what this was. They had very few of these. I mean, the series, if you see, this is 512, and it didn't even start at number 0, so there weren't even 500 releases in this series. But they tried it, and RCA's 45, for whatever reason, just went gangbusters. And I have to say that probably the reason was not sound quality, because the sound quality was probably equal on systems back then, but the fact that 45s had the big center hole, that you need this for. And for some reason, Columbia decided, no, we're going to stick with the regular spindle hole. Probably because that was the standard for 78s. I thought, what's this big, crazy spindle hole that RCA is trying to shove down our throats? But a lot of DJs, if you go online and Google it, there's a lot of articles in Billboard where DJs were saying, you know what? It's much easier to have a stack of 45s with a big hole because they're easier to grab. So it was just easier for them to do that. Excuse me. There was no advantage as far as size or storage with these. And in fact, if you can see, these are quite thick. If you can see, look at that. Pretty thick. I also mentioned sound quality. The sound quality on these actually wasn't probably as good as it could have been, because if you look real close, they don't use a lot of the space for grooves. They use very little. I think Columbia was concerned that turntables of the day would not be able to track too far in without being real distorted. So they only use a little bit, and there's a big wasteland here of run-out groove. I mean, look how big those stamp numbers are. And then there's this. If your needle gets to that, it is done, especially back then. So I don't know why they decided that that was a good idea as a barrier between the needle run-out groove and the precious label. But nevertheless, the sound quality was not bad on these, the ones that I've listened to. It could have been better. I'm sure if this got a good cleaning, it would sound a lot better. But for whatever reason, the 33 and a third 7-inch just didn't catch on. RCA, even though they came out a few weeks later, really got the jump on them, probably because of the small center hole. And that was the end of that. And about 10 years later, in 1959, they tried this again, but in stereo. And those are called Stereo 7, and they've got sort of a rainbow label from Columbia. And those, again, did not meet with much success. People were pretty apathetic towards them. A lot of jukeboxes, they were trying to gear it towards jukeboxes and see if jukebox owners would go for them. And I'm thinking, if my choice is between a jukebox or a home environment, the jukebox environment in a restaurant or a diner or whatever is going to be far noisier and far less susceptible to good stereo. So it's even another reason why I'm not sure why they thought that those would succeed. And at least that time, in 59 and 60, they did have the support of some other labels. RCA tried it, and that's probably the reason that format is most notable, is because a bunch of Elvis stereo 33 and a third 7-inch singles came out. But that format that time didn't catch on either, and then eventually became just a promotional thing. I think by 62 or 63 it had died out. And for about another 10 years, they were still releasing ones, stereo or not, for jukeboxes. And you've probably seen those. They've got the title and timing strip. It's sort of a mini LP version. They'd have 6 songs from an LP. There's a couple from the Beatles. I think there's a Meet the Beatles' second album, and possibly A Hard Day's Night and Something New that were in that format. But other than that, those were pretty under the radar. And I think the last one that I've seen, the ones are from 72 or 73. There's, I think, a Curtis Mayfield one. There's one for Exile on Main Street, Rolling Stones, which is very valuable. And the jacket is essentially a black and white version of the album jacket. And there's nothing on the back, which usually there wasn't, because you would be displaying that jacket atop the jukebox in a sort of display area. But 33 and a third speed plus 7-inch, whether they tried it in 1949 or 1959 or 1972, it was never really a huge thing. And if you go online and Google it, there's a good amount of information about those little LPs for jukeboxes that were out through the early 70s. There's a good amount of information about the Stereo 7 rainbow-colored ones from the late 50s, early 60s. But for these, the originals, 33 and a third 7-inch from Columbia, there's not too much info out there. And I've told you all I know, but if you've got some more info, I'd love for you to leave a comment below, and I'll share it in a future post.